South Cliff Promenade, Scarborough, Tuesday morning, August 1953. Nora Sugden, 41, of Bradford, was in the deck chair she had hired an hour earlier, third from the shelter, facing the sea. Her husband combed wool at a mill in Manningham. The mill had shut for bowling tide, Bradford's own name for the week the whole town stopped, and the Sugdens had come to Scarborough on the excursion train from Forster Square, the way they had every August since 1948. Below her, on the sand, her two children were digging with a bucket and spade bought in March and kept since then on top of the pantry cupboard in Bradford. Nora had written to her landlady in November to ask for the same room, second floor, South Cliff, the one that caught the morning light over the esplanade. The letter had been answered within the week. It always was. She was not looking at the sea particularly. She was looking at nothing in particular, which was itself the thing Bradford did not allow. There was no gong to listen for, no shift to be back from. Just the flat gray-white light off the North Sea, the striped shelters along the esplanade, and a fortnight that had been arranged in every particular since the previous autumn. What had Nora Sugden built toward since November? The room with the morning light, the bucket and spade bought before Easter, the same excursion train seat requested every year. And what did she expect Scarborough to give her on a Tuesday morning that Bradford could not? Before you can understand what the South Cliff Promenade was doing for Nora Sugden, you need to understand what Scarborough had spent 3 centuries becoming. In 1626, a spring was found running down the cliffs above the South Bay, and its water was believed to cure ailments no Bradford chemist could touch. Visitors came for the water. Inns and lodging houses followed. By the time the railway reached the town in the mid-19th century, Scarborough was already calling itself Britain's first seaside resort, the model the rest of the coast would copy. What it built to hold that claim was specific. The Grand Hotel, completed in 1867, was raised in a V-shape with 4 towers for the seasons, 12 floors for the months, 52 chimneys for the weeks of the year, a building that announced in stone that time itself was the product on sale. The Central Tramway, a funicular opened in 1881, carried visitors up the cliff from the foreshore to the esplanade, so that the walk itself required no effort a paying guest should have to make. The spa complex below the South Cliff still runs the Scarborough Spa Orchestra today, the last seaside orchestra left in Britain, playing 10 concerts a week through the summer, a continuous thread back to the town's identity as a place where a Milltown family paid for a fortnight to be somewhere organized entirely around their leisure. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British seaside holiday between 1920 and 1980. The boarding house, the promenade, the end of pier show, the Wakes Week train, the landlady who knew your family's room before you asked, and what each of these things meant for the people who organized their year around the fortnight they had booked in November. Not nostalgia for kiss-me-quick hats. The documented social reality of an institution that gave some British families 14 days of not being who they were in the mill or the factory, and turned others away at the boarding house door. What a second-floor room on the South Cliff booked every November gave a Bradford wool mill family was a fortnight of being fed, walked, and entertained by an entire town built for exactly that, something a self-catering flat in Torremolinos in 1974 was never built to do. And if you took these holidays, or your family did, put it in the comments. If your family had a Yorkshire coast fortnight, Scarborough, Filey, Bridlington, Whitby, which resort was it, and which week of the summer was always yours? Next time, the Butlins camp at Filey, and what Billy Butlin understood that the Scarborough boarding house never had to learn. Back to the promenade. What did a town built this deliberately for other people's leisure require of the family that came to use it? What Nora Sugden expected Scarborough to give her was not the sea. Bradford had no sea, but that was not the point either. The point was more specific than that. It was a landlady's dining room at 6:30 with a meal she had not cooked, a second-floor room with light she had not earned by anyone's clock, and a promenade a mile long, with nowhere in particular she had to be on it. The boarding house did not sell a room. It sold the absence for a fortnight of every domestic obligation the terraced house in Bradford required of her 350 other days a year. This is documented, not sentimental. Mass observations, holiday surveys of the period, studying comparable Lancashire and Yorkshire mill families, recorded the same pattern again and again. The boarding house was valued less for the location than for what the landlady removed from the guest day: cooking, washing, the endless accounting of a working household's week. For a Bradford Woolcomber's wife, the South Cliff room she had written for in November was not a holiday from work in the abstract. It was 14 days of not being the person who had to notice what needed doing next. The children's bucket and spade bought in March sat in that same economy. It was bought before Easter because there would be no spare money in August. The fortnight itself had already been paid for, a shilling or two at a time, into a savings club at the mill since the previous September. Everything about the 2 weeks at Scarborough had been provided for in advance by a family that could not have afforded a single unplanned thing once they arrived. What did it mean that an entire industrial household organized its financial year around a fortnight it would not take for another 11 months? And what happened to a family whose mill did not run a savings club or whose wages in a bad year left nothing to put in one?
Before you can understand what the South Cliff Promenade withheld from some families, you need to understand what no vacancies meant in Britain in the 1950s beyond a boarding house being full. Through this decade and into the next, a colour bar operated openly in large parts of British lodging and housing, documented most clearly in the photographs of everyday advertisements and refusals collected from cities like London, where a flat-to-let sign could carry, without needing to say so directly, the understanding that Black and Asian applicants need not inquire. The Bristol bus boycott of 1963 forced the practice into national news. The Race Relations Act of 1965 made discrimination in public places unlawful for the first time, and it took until 1968 for that protection to be extended to housing and employment. No documented record of a specific incident at a named Scarborough boarding house was found for this script, and none is claimed here. What is documented nationally is the pattern this decade's boarding house economy operated within. A landlady's discretion over who she took as a guest was, in this period, a legal discretion, and the same seaside town that answered Nora Sugden's November letter within the week was under no legal obligation to answer a letter from a Black British family the same way. The Scarborough Spa Orchestra played the same program to whoever was in the seats. The South Cliff room with the morning light was not guaranteed to whoever wrote for it. What did it mean for a British seaside industry built entirely on the landlady's private judgment, at a moment when that judgment was still in law, hers alone to exercise? The exclusion at the boarding house door was not the only sorting Scarborough performed. The town sorted its own visitors, bay by bay. The South Bay foreshore, the strip below the castle headland, packed with amusement arcades, rock shops, and funfair rides, was where the day tripper and the Milltown fortnight family spent their money loudly, in pennies at a time. A few hundred yards up the cliff, the South Cliff Esplanade, with its Italian gardens and its lemon-colored Regency terraces, was built and priced for a quieter, better-off visitor who wanted the same sea without the same noise underneath it. Yorkshire families understood this geography without needing it explained. If you were Nora Sugden from Manningham, you came for the amusements, the rock, the harbour, and a boarding house you could afford on a woolcomber's wage, Scarborough, not the more expensive Filey along the coast, which Yorkshire holidaymakers of the period already understood as the posher side of the tracks. The resort favoured by families with a little more to spend on a quieter, more genteel version of the same fortnight. Choosing Scarborough over Filey or a South Bay boarding house over a South Cliff hotel was not simply a matter of taste. It was a family locating itself, once a year, exactly where it believed it belonged. What did it mean that the seaside holiday, sold as an escape from the ordinary structure of the working year, reproduced that same structure in miniature, resort by resort, bay by bay, street by street. None of this ran itself. A landlady on the South Cliff spent 11 weeks of the summer keeping a boarding house that had to earn most of its year's income before September, remembering which returning family took which room, which child would not eat tinned peas, which father wanted his tea at 6:30 sharp because the excursion train timetable never changed. The deckchair attendants on the esplanade held informal territory over the same stretch of promenade year after year, recognizing regulars before they had paid. Musicians in the Scarborough Spa Orchestra played their 10th concert of the week to a hall that would be a third empty by October, in a job that existed for exactly the months the mill towns emptied into the resort. This workforce saw the fortnight from a side the holidaymaker never did. A landlady watched 100 families a year rehearse the same relief on arrival. The shoulders that dropped an inch on the doorstep. The mother who looked, for the first time that year, like she was not doing sums. Nora Sugden did not know that Mrs. Robshaw, her landlady, had seen the exact same thing in 100 women exactly like her every August since the war. That was the trade the seasonal worker made, watching all summer other people arrive at the 14 days they had spent the other 50 weeks earning. What happened to that workforce and to the town's whole calendar in the years the fortnight stopped filling? The one evening of the fortnight that required dressing up was the concert or the variety bill at the Spa Theatre. For a family whose other 13 nights were spent on the promenade, in the boarding house lounge, or queuing for chips, an evening at the spa was the occasion the whole holiday had been quietly building toward. The one night, Nora Sugden put on the dress she had kept for it, and her husband wore the jacket that otherwise stayed on its hook at home. The Spa Orchestra's program mixed light classical pieces with popular numbers of the day, a format built to please a mixed summer audience rather than a specialist one, precisely because that audience was mixed. Mill families from Bradford and Halifax sitting in the same hall as the season's better-off South Cliff visitors for one evening on one shared program. It was one of the only places in Scarborough's class geography where the South Bay family and the South Cliff family occupied the same seats. What did an evening built to be shared by everyone in the hall tell a Bradford Mill family about what the rest of their fortnight had deliberately kept separate? By the mid-1960s, the price comparison that had never existed before started to arrive in Bradford's post offices and travel agents' windows. A fortnight in Spain, flight included, for close to what a family had been paying Mrs. Robshaw for a boarding house room alone. Thomson Holidays launched Britain's first mass package tour in 1965. Within a decade, the maths that had made Scarborough automatic for a Woolcombers family stopped being automatic at all. The decline showed up in the buildings before it showed up in any statistic a family in Manningham would have read. Visitor numbers at British seaside resorts fell through the 1960s and 1970s as cheap flights and guaranteed sun drew the package holiday trade away from the coast. In Scarborough, the clearest single marker of that shift came in 1978, when the Grand Hotel, the building that had announced in towers and chimneys that Scarborough sold the entire calendar, was sold to Butlins, the holiday camp company, after a decade in which rumors had already circulated that it might be converted into flats instead. The hotel that had represented the town's whole claim to be Britain's first and grandest resort changed hands not because Scarborough had stopped being beautiful, but because the fortnight it had been built to sell no longer needed to be spent there. What was Mrs. Robshaw's booking list doing? In the years, the Grand Hotel's own future was in doubt. Mrs. Robshaw's boarding house on the South Cliff took its last full bowling tide booking from a Bradford Mill family in the summer of 1975. What the package holiday gave the family that came after: guaranteed sun, a pool, a flight instead of a 5-hour excursion train. What it did not give them: the second-floor room with the morning light that Nora Sugden had asked for every November since 1948. The meal she had not cooked. The spa theatre concert that required a good dress and a night out, shared with families who lived in a different part of Scarborough's own geography for the other 13 nights of the fortnight. The South Cliff Esplanade is still there. The Central Tramway still climbs it. The Scarborough Spa Orchestra still plays 10 concerts a week. The last seaside orchestra left in the country, in a town that no longer needs 11 weeks of the summer to survive the rest of its year. The Grand Hotel changed hands again after Butlins. The boarding houses that closed became flats, or bed and breakfasts, for a different kind of visitor, or nothing at all. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the British seaside holiday was and what it meant to the people who shaped their year around it, subscribe. There are more boarding houses, more piers, more Wednesday evenings, more Wakes Week trains, and more landladies who knew which room you preferred before you asked. What a second-floor room on the South Cliff booked every November gave a Bradford Woolmill family was a fortnight of being fed, walked, and entertained by an entire town, built for exactly that. Something a self-catering flat in Torremolinos in 1974 was never built to do. And if you have a resort of your own, a boarding house, a promenade, a Wednesday evening, put it in the comments. If your family had a Yorkshire Coast fortnight, which resort was it, and which week of the summer was always yours? Next time, the Butlins camp at Filey, and what Billy Butlin understood that the Scarborough boarding house never had to learn. Nora Sugden's daughter took a Thompson Holidays flight to the Costa Brava in 1976. The apartment had a balcony and a pool and sun every day of the fortnight. There was no landlady who asked after her mother by name. There was no orchestra playing to a mixed hall on a Wednesday evening. She sent a postcard back to Bradford. She did not write in November to book the same room again the following year, because there was no longer a room to write for. The South Cliff Promenade is still there. The fortnight that filled it every August is gone.